Agent Harris's habit of helpfully dropping intelligence in Tony Soprano's lap is often mistaken for sentimentality, as though federal law enforcement occasionally develops a soft spot for a man whose core competencies include extortion, assault, and casually outsourcing homicide. The more plausible reading is colder, cleaner, and therefore more honest. Encouraging a volatile organization to fracture is simply cost-effective policing. If enough suspicion, paranoia, and rivalry can be seeded, the enterprise begins performing its own downsizing. No subpoenas required, no wiretap affidavits, no courtroom theatrics. In the early seasons, the Bureau's posture resembles classic agitation. Stir the pot, let the temperature rise, and watch otherwise disciplined criminals turn into amateur demolition crews. Later, once Harris is reassigned to counterterrorism, the calculus shifts again, not because anyone reformed, but because priorities do. Organized crime becomes a familiar nuisance. International terrorism becomes the all-consuming mandate. In that context, Tony is less enemy than workable asset, a local contact with situational usefulness, and an address book full of men who mistake impulse control for weakness. It is not charity, it is triage. And yet, the line that detonates the ethical facade, "We're going to win this thing," betrays something more humiliating than strategy: identification. The professional boundary dissolves into the sports bar psychology of rooting for a home team, where New Jersey becomes the scrappy underdog and New York becomes the arrogant rival one is emotionally invested in seeing lose. That rivalry is not even abstract. There is a stated personal grievance. Phil Leotardo is associated with an attempted setup of a female agent for sexual violence and assault, and Harris's animus is framed as both personal and institutional. The enemy of one's enemy becomes one's regrettable collaborator, and retaliation is outsourced through proxies because the badge forbids direct vengeance. The show does not present this as noble, just human, which is to say, compromised. It is also pointedly tethered to real-world scandal, invoking the shadow of FBI supervisor Linley DeVecchio, who was indicted and ultimately not convicted for allegedly feeding a Columbo figure information linked to multiple murders. The series' late-stage depiction of Harris is not a random character quirk. It is a dramatized cautionary tale about long exposure to criminal ecosystems, where law enforcers begin absorbing the very logic they claim to oppose, then congratulating themselves for complexity when they cross lines that would get ordinary people fired, prosecuted, or both. The result is a portrait of corruption without the melodrama, not a mustache-twirling villain, but a functionary whose boredom, resentment, and nostalgia for the old assignment metastasize into an exception that becomes a habit. Counterterrorism is depicted as miserable, far from home, sickened by travel, stuck in paper trails, tracking strangers one neither understands nor likes, while mob work is familiar and perversely satisfying. Field work, verbal sparring, the cat-and-mouse choreography with personalities that, however criminal, are at least legible. The show even hints at personal unraveling, domestic strain, a sense of displacement, so that helping Tony reads less like a plot twist and more like coping. A man trying to regain control by returning to the only game he felt fluent in. This is where the analysis gets uncomfortably sharp. Tony's enduring advantage is not merely intimidation, it is interpersonal competence. He is highly intelligent in the managerial sense, adept at reading incentives, applying pressure, offering a carrot with one hand and a stick with the other. That skill does not stop at his crew or his family. It bleeds outward to adversaries, therapists, and law enforcement. The shift visible in Harris over time, disdain turning to pity, pity to sympathy, sympathy to civility, civility to grudging respect, tracks Tony's talent for making even his watchers feel as though they are participating in a relationship rather than a case file. It is also why Dr. Melfi's termination of treatment can be read as abrupt, even ethically clumsy. The decisive moment arrives only when she has the strength to act before being pulled back into Tony's gravitational field. In the same spirit, Harris initially refuses Tony's plea for help against Phil, then later relents after obtaining intelligence through an improper channel, an asset in the Bureau, a personal entanglement, a burner call, committing an ethical breach so large it ought to have career-ending consequences. The series presents this as a small tragedy of institutional rot. Tony's sociability becomes a survival tool, and the lawman's self-conception as righteous becomes a costume he keeps wearing while doing things that are not remotely righteous. At the thematic level, the Harris arc also functions as a mirror. The FBI crew and the mob crew differ in uniforms and legal authority, but share territoriality, ego, shortcuts, and the seductive thrill of winning. It is the same vanity with different stationery. The more cynical reading goes further. Perhaps the assistance is also manipulation, a chess match in multiple dimensions, with New York and New Jersey both being played to serve a larger institutional agenda. The series leaves room for that suspicion because it understands a basic truth. Bureaucracy rarely does purity. It does incentives. If Tony can be nudged into eliminating a more volatile rival, that is a public safety outcome achieved without messy litigation. If Phil is more dangerous, more vindictive, more likely to menace surveillance teams or retaliate against civilians, then helping Tony looks like risk reduction. It is also, frankly, easier. This devil-you-know logic is presented repeatedly. Tony is awful, but he is familiar, occasionally principled in the narrowest possible sense, and, most damningly, likable in the way charismatic predators often are. Put him next to Phil, and he even looks reasonable, which is a triumph of contrast so cynical it practically writes the indictment itself. This same moral erosion frames the show's treatment of law enforcement more broadly, especially in its handling of informants. The Bureau's management of human assets is portrayed as reckless at best and grotesque at worst. People are flipped, handled poorly, protected inadequately, and then discarded when the risks become inconvenient. Multiple deaths cascade from that negligence, and the most emotionally searing example is Adriana, pressured, monitored, lied to, and ultimately left to die with no meaningful protection. The discomfort is not only that it happens, but that it happens with an institutional shrug, as though informants are consumables rather than people. The show even underlines the ugliness through parallels, handlers and criminals discussing work, each insisting on a higher purpose while behaving like self-interested operators. It becomes a critique not simply of one agency, but of governance as a whole, a portrait of American moral decay spreading beyond the mafia and into the offices tasked with stopping it, until the difference between predator and protector is sometimes just who gets to file the paperwork afterward. Even the depiction of female agents is not flattering. When power arrives, cruelty often follows. One agent's social assent, becoming one of the boys, is used to rationalize contempt for the vulnerable target she is assigned to cultivate, a miniature study in how institutions reward hardness and punish empathy, then call it professionalism. The show's social satire sharpens further when race enters the dialogue. Characters repeatedly treat "blame it on black people" as a ready-made alibi, a cynical exploitation of societal prejudice that is both disgusting and depressingly plausible. And the series uses it to expose how criminality leans on broader systemic bias. If the mafia is a parasite, it is also an opportunist, living off the weaknesses of the host culture, and the host culture provides plenty of nutrients. Running parallel to this institutional critique is a second category of commentary: the show's relationship to realism, and the audience's willingness to forgive implausibility when the writing is confident enough to smirk while doing it. Complaints cluster around policing and consequences. The series depicts a parade of murders that should generate heat: civilians killed in public places, assaults with witnesses, shootings with obvious forensic trails, yet often evaporate into narrative air. Christopher and Polly's restaurant fiasco is a prime exhibit. An outrageous bill, a public confrontation, a murder in a parking lot, and then a serene drive home, justified by the belief that no one knows us here, as though geography disables basic investigative procedure. The disbelief extends to Christopher shooting a bakery employee, Bobby committing a hit in a laundromat, and Polly murdering an elderly acquaintance. These are not subtle crimes, and the absence of sustained follow-up can make the world feel less like a living ecosystem and more like a stylized crime fantasia. There are attempted rationalizations. Law enforcement needs witnesses and hard proof. Cases take years. The Bureau prefers to build ironclad prosecutions rather than chase smaller charges. Local police are discouraged from making arrests that could jeopardize larger federal investigations. Corrupt cops and intimidated witnesses smooth over the rough edges. All of that has some internal logic, and the series even nods to it. Federal impatience with local disruptions, long-game investigations folded into broader racketeering strategy, but it cannot fully launder the sense that certain moments are simply waved past because the show is not, and never wanted to be, a procedural. It is a character study, a social critique, a dark comedy, and sometimes a funhouse mirror. The price of that artistic choice is that when realism is invoked, it is invoked selectively, and selective realism is just another kind of storytelling convenience. The series defenders respond with their own indictment of realism as a standard. Mobsters have historically gotten away with murder. Corruption and fear do blunt investigations. The world is not fair. And comparing this messy plausibility to other crime dramas that lean on elaborate contraptions and operatic set pieces is itself an exercise in selective outrage. The disagreement is less about facts than taste. Whether one prefers the slow dread of a sustained federal investigation or the episodic indulgence of crimes that vanish into the background because the show has other targets in its sights. Then there's the third category, plot holes, a term often deployed when a viewer's suspension of disbelief is asked to do calisthenics. Some are serious, some are knowingly unserious, and the most entertaining ones are the complaints that sound like satire but still land because they expose the show's tonal audacity. There is the self-important line about reclaiming Rome, delivered in the unmistakable setting of a New Jersey strip club, a grand historical fantasy collapsing into fluorescent banality. There is the Clarence gag, pointing out that one actor appears in multiple roles and the series offers no explanation, as though the audience is expected to accept that the universe occasionally reuses faces the way it reuses restaurant sets. There is the perennial mystery of Phil's prison time, hinted at, mythologized, and yet never stated with the obsessive clarity one might expect from a man who would surely mention it every 5 minutes if it were central to his identity. There are physical implausibilities. Tony escaping an FBI perimeter on foot like a stealth athlete no one saw coming. Bobby dunking in a way that is either miraculous or, more plausibly, performed on a rim too low to deserve the name. Tony pulling a firearm from a fish and firing in broad daylight with the serene confidence of a man who believes sunlight is a legal defense. There are mechanical quibbles dressed as realism critiques. A transmission slipping in precisely the cinematic manner required to crush a man's legs, because vehicles in fiction frequently suffer malfunctions that behave like intent. There are continuity and staging complaints. Jackie Jr. failing to see a large man standing in front of him just before being killed, the FBI surrounding a location and somehow missing a 6-foot-plus, nearly 300-pound suspect, unless the more convenient explanation is that the agents were positioned in ways that made the escape possible, under a porch, lines of sight limited, because the narrative needed Tony to run. There are forensic absences, such as the near-total lack of DNA evidence being used to pinch anyone, with the sardonic aside that perhaps only one victim ever generated the kind of investigation modern viewers expect. There are the show's own meta-jokes masquerading as unrealistic scenes. Tony throwing away a sandwich after one bite, presented as the true break from Catholic plausibility. A character refusing lasagna in a moment treated as more unbelievable than any murder. And the classic punchline that the most intense police investigation in the entire series involves pizza. Because sometimes the show's satire aims straight at the viewer's expectations and hits. The plot hole discourse also turns into character critique, especially when romance enters the frame. Vito's detour into an idyllic New Hampshire gay paradise is attacked as implausible. A storm conveniently drops branches, a car conveniently fails, and a man with bad hips conveniently lands within walking distance of a quaint inn, then within days finds acceptance, employment prospects, and a handsome firefighter partner with what is described, politely, as unusually flexible standards. But the counter-argument reframes it as intentional absurdity. It is a fairy tale, complete with symbolic costuming and storybook settings, designed to be too perfect so that the inevitable return to violence reads as tragic self-sabotage. In that reading, Johnny Cakes is less a realistic partner than a narrative device, illustrating the inescapability of the life. Even when the door to escape opens, the character walks back into the burning building because identity is heavier than survival. The same impulse drives the recurring sarcasm about AJ's romantic success, how a chronically whiny, physically unimposing young man repeatedly attracts striking partners. Another example of the show bending plausibility to serve its thematic needs, this time as commentary on status, money, and the strange magnetism of proximity to power. Threaded through these grievances are the series' signature aphorisms and the audience's debates about what they mean, which is another way of saying the show's language is so quotable that people will argue over a metaphor involving insects and rent. If there are any flies on you, they're paying rent, becomes a miniature lecture on street wisdom. The point is that no one can take advantage, not even a fly resting on someone's body, without paying for the privilege. And in an even more exaggerated translation, the bee on the hat is imagined as paying an absurd sum, because hyperbole is often how these characters express respect. Another line, some people are so far behind in the race, they actually believe that they're leading, is treated as a self-contained insult, and also as something with a historical reference, a reminder that the series loves embedding its cynicism in language that sounds ancient, authoritative, and therefore weaponized. Yet the most revealing quote is Harris's. "We're going to win this thing." The line that collapses the moral distinction between cop and criminal into the shared intoxication of competition. In the end, the commentary converges on one coherent editorial conclusion. The Sopranos is not a morality play where justice arrives on schedule. It is a diagnosis of systems, criminal, governmental, cultural, where incompetence, vanity, and self-interest are the default settings, and where the audience is implicated as much as entertained. The show's genius is not that it makes criminals sympathetic, but that it makes the surrounding institutions similarly compromised, sometimes similarly petty, and occasionally similarly cruel, until the spectacle stops being about good versus evil and starts being about how easily people confuse familiarity with virtue. If that feels unsettling, it is because it should. The series is not asking for admiration. It is documenting decay, then letting everyone, mobsters, agents, viewers, pretend they are above it while eagerly watching the next body fall.
Subscribe for more video like this.